Used to want it, used to need it. It's the roundup, guys. I have a lot of albums I've been listening to since I haven't been recording these, so I have a lot to get through. And we're gonna start off right now. Now. Rancid's Out Come the Wolves is a 1995 punk rock album, which is considered one of the 4 punk rock albums that allowed punk to enter the mainstream. This, along with Smash by The Offspring, Dookie by Green Day, and Stranger Than Fiction by Bad Religion. Rancid's Out Come the Wolves, compared to the other 3, is a little bit more abrasive, a little bit more aggressive, has a strong ska influence as well. And amongst the 4, I wouldn't say it's my favorite, as I do have a large soft spot for Dookie as a seminal album in me growing up. I gained a lot of appreciation and joy for Rancid, and found a lot of joy in Out Come the Wolves. Even 20 some years later, and understanding that it's sort of a precursor to a style of punk that a lot of people have strong qualms with, I found a lot to enjoy. It's abrasive enough, it has enough teeth to give it a little bit of a bite to probably offend your parents in circa 1995 Bill Clinton's America, but at the same time, there's enough poppy elements and hooks to attract people who may not be as comfortable with punk, in the 80s era, thinking of the Misfits, thinking of Black Flag, thinking of the Dead Kennedys, which was a much more abrasive version. There's some fantastic singles on this album, including Time Bomb, Roots Radical, and Ruby Soho, that implement some more. Those songs, even in particular, bring out the variety in this album. It's not so straightforward as Dookie might be, where there's actually elements of oi, there's elements of ska in this album. So it's a little bit more varied, which is important because this is a 50-minute album, and a 50-minute punk album is a pretty dangerous gamble where it can easily wear way too thin, and way too fast. Fortunately, Rancid's Out Come the Wolves is a very enjoyable listen from start to finish, with a wide variety of sounds, with enough teeth to kind of throw you a little off kilter, but not too much as to throw you out into the deep end of the water. Although an older album, I still highly recommend it. It is kind of interesting that an album like this was part of the precursor of a giant wave of pop punk bands that, while loved by many, also were the ire of more of the traditional hardcore punk fans that felt that albums like this created the downfall of their genre and commercialized it. In that context, you can look at it sort of in a negative way, but it's also to this album's testament that's able to blend a commercialized, well-mixed sound with this more raw, aggressive tonation, which is a delicate balance to achieve, and one that's not necessarily an easy one to do, and Rancid does it quite expertly compared to other albums in the future, and even its peers at the time. Overall, it's a real joy to listen to. It's a lot of fun. Only near the very end does it feel like it's starting to wear. And I listened to this one in 2 sessions, so perhaps maybe that's why it wasn't too bad for me. But I highly recommend Rancid's Out Come the Wolves. Steve Reich is an experimental artist that I know nothing about, and he created an album called Different Trains / Electric Counterpart, which is effectively like 2 little EPs glued together. Different Trains features the Kronos Quartet, and Electric Counterpart features Pat Metheny. And these 2 halves are very distinct, very different to each other, but coming together fit really quite well. Different Trains with Kronos Quartet has this atonal, swelling sound to it of these strings coming together. This, and if you've ever listened to Kronos Quartet, this sort of atonal, this kind of dystonic sound that doesn't quite always come together, but it builds and builds and builds. It's quite an interesting experience to listen to, and only about 25 minutes this first half of the album. Even if it's really throwing you off, ultimately it's not going to be too much to really upset you and really put you too much in the deep end of the water. I think where the album really comes alive is in the second half, Electric Counterpoint with Pat Metheny, who's a jazz guitarist, and you almost get this sort of Robert Fripp orchestra of crafty guitarists, guitar interweaving work that's just multiple different ideas interweaving at once. Almost reminds me of 80s King Crimson, but way more toned down, a lot more mellow in terms of speed and aggressiveness, or even Battles in some of their work. So the different styles of music, or the different guitar pieces, are interweaving, interconnecting at points coming perfectly in sync with each other and at different points separating from each other. And again, with Electric Counterpoint being the shorter of it, only about 13 minutes. I really wish this was the longer part of the two, as different trains. Eventually near the end, I was like, I'm good and done on this. As much as I like Kronos Quartet, usually their work ends up running a little bit longer than my tolerance will allow it for, and I kind of feel like I've been assaulted too much, and I'm not catching the plot. And that's sort of similar here. This has a little bit more of an ambience to it, a little less jagged compared to other Kronos Quartet pieces. And then Electric Counterpoint is a lot more melodic, a lot more soothing, pleasant to listen to. The version I have of this has both of these together. I don't know if they initially come separate. Either way, as a whole, it's a great listen if you're into more experimental work, if you're open to music that has less structure and form. You won't be steered wrong. It's a pleasant experience. It's sort of a challenging experience, but a challenging experience that's not too daring, not too relentless, that's not going to kill you if you're not ready for it, unlike some other types of music in this sort of genre. Overall, it's a pleasant go. It's a pleasant time, and it's a shorter listen, only 42 minutes. And when split in two, you kind of have two separate listening experiences. You can easily stop after the different train section, go listen to something a little bit more appealing, then come back to Electric Counterpoint. With that in mind, you end up with two EPs, both with the short enough runtime that it's at no point are you feeling too lost, too discombobulated, even if it's something that you're not specifically into and you're just challenging yourself with a new experience. I think by the time you finally hit your limit, it's going to be over with. Maybe not necessarily a purchase for all people, but I think it's definitely worth a listen. Overall, I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a great short experience to listen to. In 2003, people listened to Nelly. Do we remember Nelly? I remember Nelly. And I remember that he had a lot of great singles. He put out a lot of really good songs and then just kind of vanished from existence. I'm sure he's still putting out albums, but it's been kind of forgotten about, which is a shame, because actually he was quite gifted, and I thought actually was, in hindsight, kind of wrongly forgotten about. I don't know if maybe his later work just wasn't as strong, but he had some really good stuff in the early part of his career. In 2003, he released the Derrty versions, the Reinvention, which is sort of a reworking of a lot of his songs. And at an hour and 18 minutes, it's a long listen. A lot of the songs that you're familiar with have been extended, with crammed with more material, more lyrics, more verses, more instrumental pieces. It's an extra long Nelly. And is it worth it? No, absolutely not. You start off with Country Grammar, and as lazy of a remix as it is, it's literally the same song, maybe with some minor mix differences, and they include an extra verse from a guest MC, if I'm remembering correctly, and that's it. That is literally it. The rest of these are very minor, light retoolings, reworkings of these songs with not a whole lot done to them. With the title of The Reinvention, you kind of are imagining that he's going to be completely cutting up, completely redesigning these songs, possibly handing them over to other people along the lines of remixing by clipping, which we discussed last time. But it's not. It's very safe, very comfortable renditions of the song, which in itself wouldn't be wrong, but when you're describing this as The Reinvention, you're thinking that he's redesigning, he's reconceptualizing songs, and he's not. He's simply repackaging them in a slightly different bow. There are versions of these songs that are kind of interesting. They're not, and I wouldn't say any of these are bad. Ride With Me all of a sudden becomes instantly more aggressive, or Air Force One's kind of mellows out a little bit. So there's slight retoolings of them, but ultimately the flows are the same, the lyrics are primarily in the same order. There's not much of a dramatic reinvention of everything, and so it becomes, you're kind of sitting there going, why am I listening to this? I'm not getting a whole lot out of this. It's just the same shit that I've listened to before, just very modestly retooled. I mean, if you're deeply nostalgic for Nelly, it might be worth your time, but If you're thinking of, hey, I want to try to add some new stuff to a DJ set or a party mix, this isn't really going to provide you with a whole lot. You might confuse a few people if you throw this on, but ultimately it's really not worth your time, and especially at a nearly 80 minutes. I'm sure this wasn't designed to be a sit and listen. It was to sort of pick and choose some new stuff, but it's also exhausting to listen to as well. Prog rock in the 70s, in the 60s was running rampant. Near the later end of the 70s, it started to slowly die out and become a parody of itself before being gobbled up by the pop-entrenched 80s. Near the later end of the progressive run, Kansas put out Leftoverture. Kansas is an American rock band, coincidentally from Kansas. And in 1976, they released Leftoverture, which is sort of a progressive rock album. I don't know a whole lot about Kansas beyond that, but Kansas, being from the States, is one of the rare exceptions of an American prog rock band, considering it is primarily a British concoction. And you may know Kansas from their hit single Carry On Wayward Son, which is the opener to this album. I really do dig that song, and I've listened to that song over and over and over again, and then all of a sudden I'm presented with the rest of this album. And I'm kind of shocked that ultimately, in 1976, prog rock as itself it's not dead, but it's definitely far from the height of its popularity it was a few years before. And whether Kansas knew that or this was a stroke of luck, I'm not totally certain, not knowing Kansas, but they created this wonderful little album here in Leftoverture, which is a very smart balance of progressive rock and also more straightforward 70s hard rock. So it teeters a fine line between the two ideas, never falling too far into either direction, which is really important because it creates an accessibility for a wider audience to get hooked on catchy hooks, fun choruses, sing-along lyrics, and some good quality riffage, and tickles the fancy of more, let's say, pretentious, more experienced music listeners that want something a little bit more complex than might have already gone to an Emerson, Lake and Palmer concert. So there's this good balance between the two where you do get that complicated instrumentation, but at the same time it's never overdone because you're also getting this more straightforward rock kind of stuff, which also means none of the songs run particularly long, with the longest being Magnum Opus, coincidentally, by the title, at about 8.5 minutes, which is long by standard rock songs, but compared to songs like Lizard, Selling England by the Pound, Close to the Edge, 2112, that are running 20 plus minutes, nothing here is overly overwrought that doesn't just make you want to roll your eyes if you're not really deep into that kind of shit. So the challenge Kansas runs into is that its greatest strength is also its greatest weakness. Because it toes this line so well, you never feel like it's really picking a side. It's trying to have its cake and eat it too. It's trying to balance two things that may not necessarily do a great job of balancing each other. It doesn't necessarily do a good job of really exemplifying one side over the other. You get a good smattering of both, but then you're never really blown away from either direction. You're not like, oh, this is an amazing rock riff, or this is a stupidly complex piano solo that I'm just having my mind blown by. Carry On Wayward Son is a perfect example of this in the opening track, where there's moments where there's that progressive-y kind of bits. You have some good keyboard solos with some fun little drum work. You have that catchy da-da-da-da-da-da-da rock riff, but you're never really moved in one direction too strongly. So it's almost like it's a little too nerdy for the rock fans and a little too skullduggery for the nerdy guys. I think it's still a great album because it toes a line that's really challenging, but it just doesn't quite get over the hill in terms of really blowing me away in either direction. Is it worth the listen? Absolutely. If you haven't listened to this and you're a fan of 70s style rock and roll, or you're a fan of progressive rock and you've never listened to Leftoverture, you're missing out on a great album that will tickle your fancy either way. But is it worth a purchase? That's a hard question to answer, because it's just not quite either direction. And the reason that's important is because there's so many albums from this era in both camps that just are master classes, either your hard rock of Led Zeppelin or your progressive rock of Yes. And with Kansas, you're teetering this line, not really nailing it on either front. So you're kind of just left going, it's good, it just should be great. And it misses the mark both ways. It's good on two fronts, but not great on one, which is its biggest flaw. If you're looking for a more chaotic and upsetting listen, I recommend Broken Ear Record by Black Dice, a experimental electronic industrial chaotic mess. Black Dice's Broken Ear Record is not for the faint of heart. It features a hilarious cover art of a naked individual cleverly covered up by a random bric-a-brac of collage work. The music itself is challenging from a sonic perspective, often sounding like the music has broken, like it is just been smashed to smithereens. It also changes tempo and pattern pretty quickly, but at the same time, if you're into this sort of experimental style of music, or you're curious about it, this is an album that, while it's gonna throw you for a loop, it's not gonna fully bite your head off. There's moments like in the tracks Smiling Off and Street Dude where there's a swagger, there's a catchy swing kind of vibe to it, so it's playful in its destructiveness. It's like a 2-year-old you can't just help but laugh at, even though it's destroying something that you love right in front of you, because it's like, there's a charm to it. And that's what Broken Ear Record has. It has a charm to its destructive nature, to its violence, even though it's broken to its core. There's enough pieces of familiarity that you follow it to the end. At sub 40 minutes, barely sub 40 minutes, it lets you walk away rather unscathed versus an album, by KG Hino or Boredoms, which is easily running 70 minutes or more. It's pushing you, it's going to challenge you, but it's never going to fully bite your head off in one go. Yet the tracks are pretty long for the most part. Opener Snarly Yow, Smiling Off, and track 5 Street Dude are all pretty long, running 8, 9, and 7 minutes respectively. But there's some other tracks such as Twins and Heavy Manners, which are at a much more digestible 4 and 12 minutes respectively. And then you have songs like ABA, which is not even a minute. So even if you could listen to shorter tracks to determine do I really want to take on this longer experience. And would I say it's worth your time? I think it's a fun curiosity in terms of experimental music, in terms of this sort of industrial experimental electronic music. It catches my interest. It reminds me of sort of a more futuristic Throbbing Gristle, where there is enough of a pattern and a melody to latch onto. It's just done with the most disgusting, gross noises that could be conceived. And I have a soft spot for that. I have a soft spot for a pop-centric kind of structure, but done in the grossest way possible. And like I said, there are plenty of moments in this album where there is something cohesive that's moving along. It's just done through a grain thresher. So it's like if the Beatles were distorted to Kingdom Come. So, if you're going to kind of know what you're getting into based on that description. Obviously, if you're looking for a soft, easy to listen to listen, this is definitely not going to be for you. But if you like a little vodka in your morning orange juice, this is going to be a good one for you. Wrapping up today's episode, just today I listened to the new release from Dr. Octagon, the alter ego of Kool Keith, called Moosebumps, an exploration into modern day horripilation. I listened to the first Dr. Octagon a couple months ago and was interested in it, and was interested in what it could do for the future of hip-hop, but I didn't ultimately love the listen as a whole. The shock factor, which also was coincidentally the schlock factor, was not something I really fell in love with. It felt a little too jokey. It felt a little too corny in a way, like 80s horror film kind of corny. If that's the intention, it was successful. But ultimately, it was something I didn't feel like I was going to go back to, despite my recognition and appreciation of its historical significance. Octagon released another album many years after that, and then many years now after that, he's returning with this Moosebumps record, featuring Juan El Derrty of many, many bands, including Obviously, the Mars Volta, Vato Negro, Halo Orbit, Big Sur, Deltron, Racer X, now Marilyn Manson as well. And also featuring some wonderful production work by the ever amazing Dan the Automator. Dr. Octagon's Moosebumps feels like Dr. Octagon, but a little bit more grown up, a little bit more mature. Gone are all the sort of sex jokes, the vagina jokes that feel kind of immature and childish, and things feel a little bit more. They feel like they've grown up. There's a bit of a suit and tie on this clown that you so to speak. It's darker, it's grittier, but ultimately it's still at its core classic hip hop. Frontman Kool Keith's alter ego pays deep respect to hip hop of the 90s and 80s with really catchy beats, some wonderful record scratch work, breakbeat work, more of minimal on features, and some wonderful sampling, some wonderful solid production work that lays a framework for him to provide really solid verbal play. I was a little surprised that a lot of these tracks have much stronger instrumental pieces versus other hip-hop work, and even versus the other Dr. Octagon album I listened to. There's many tracks where you'll have the last minute and a half, which is purely instrumental, purely just grooving on riffs, a lot of turntable work. So it gives recognition to the backing band he has. And in this album, as far as I'm understanding, it's effectively a proper backing band. It's less sample work. There is plenty of that, but there's live instrumentation. Juan does a significant amount of the bass work, which you can clearly tell by his wonderful, delicious, deep, gristly bass tones, drum work, and the like. So it's a good balance of live and sampling. And when you hear those live musicians working together, they're creating something really, truly special that I give them a lot of praise for stepping back and letting that come out. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the features that are there. They're minimal, but the one that obviously bears mentioning is 3030 Meets the Doc Part 1 featuring Deltron. It hits me so. It's so beautiful that we have this meeting of Dr. Octagon and Deltron. It's just, you couldn't ask for something better, and they play off each other brilliantly. Their rhyme work is fantastic, and they share the space in an impeccable way, and both of them being highly respected, classic, legendary MCs is demonstrated here in a masterful way. I was blown away by the modernity of the album, but at the same time, shocked at the deep respect this album provides for old school hip hop and nodding to the luminaries of the past that seemingly are forgotten in our wave of SoundCloud rap and trap work. It's a little weird that this album being in 2018 and still having a modernness to it also still feels dated in a way. It comes out the gate feeling like it was invented or recorded in 1998 and only being released now. And it reminds me a little bit of rockabilly in a way, and especially a band like the Cramps used to be, where clearly rockabilly was not a popular form of music anymore, but they were still finding new ways of presenting it. Classic hip-hop, old school hip-hop, however you want to define it, is obviously no longer deeply in vogue. It's no longer popular, but it still has a very valuable place. And it's a style of music that I don't think was properly fully mined and fleshed out before it was abandoned. Its emphasis on classic funk, jazz, breakbeats to create its foundation was sort of dumped at the wayside as hip hop evolved, and we didn't really think about what we could do if we go back to that classic art form and don't rely specifically on old samples, such as here, where you have this classic structure, this older school structure, but it's primarily live instruments, it's primarily its own invention as opposed to a funky drummer for the millionth time. So it's a style of hip-hop that I feel like there's so much more to go back to. And there are still hip-hop artists that are paying respect to that style of work, that are still exploring that, and it's a really good thing that it is. It's still it's a necessity at this point. And Dr. Octagon provides a masterclass in it, and in 2018 he's releasing this album that I think everyone should listen to. If you're a fan of new rap, This is a good way to get back to explore old rap and what it was all about. And if you're a fan of old rap, obviously it's a trip down memory lane. And even if you're not a fan of hip hop, the instrumental work is fantastic. And there's plenty of moments where he takes a step back and allows his band to play. He allows the musicians to play. The turntable work is impeccable. Some fantastic work is being done there, creating its own world of sounds and textures. It's a deep, deep recommendation. Stay tuned. More to come. More albums to catch up on. This is the Roundup.